I started the recording. Hello, everyone. This is the Keptn community meeting on October 28th. Thanks for joining. I will just open up the agenda and start sharing my screen now. Hopefully you see what I see. I want to continue the discussion of the Keptn quality gates. So we had two action items from last meeting. It was that Andy and Rob said they will provide a sample SLO file that include some more details on Tinterdex community meetings. So we've already managed to include that or incorporate that sample SLO into the Keptn quality gates use case document. And we'll briefly swift through the changes and just point out what is different now. And Christian from the Keptn team will enlighten us more on the details of how the pass and warning criteria actually will work. And this was an action item for me, but I asked one of my colleagues to actually do that. So Florian will provide us with information on how to write SLI providers in this community meeting. So. But I will do this one, but I got the file from Andy and Rob. And with that, I would just jump right into what has changed in the Keptn quality gates use case document. Prerequisites stay the same. We renamed the service level indicators to response time. We discussed this last time because request latency was, well, not that well received from some. And I also think that response time is more sprechend. I'm missing the English word right now.
Self-explaining.
Self-explanatory, thank you very much. When coming to the service level objectives configuration, a few changes happened. So this is an example SLO file, and Christian will walk us through a very detailed service level objective configuration later on. But bear with me, so we've discussed the filter section previously, where you can, for example, provide the ID of a Prometheus scrap job. And you, of course, can override project stage or service values if needed. For comparison, we have the possibility to define if you want to compare with a single result or with several results, and also define a filter if you only want to compare to previous past results, or if you also want to consider warning results, for example, in the comparison. As for the objectives themselves, they consist of a reference to an SLI. So this is the name of the SLI. It's actually error rate. And then you need to define the pass criteria, and you can define warn criteria if you want to, but more to that in the detail later on. And we, due to many requests, have reinstated the scoring into the SLO file, where you have the possibility to define weights for objectives and always have a total score of an evaluation that is a value between 0 and 1. So it can be displayed as a percentage value. So it does not change over time. So you always have a good reference to the previous builds when it's always a percentage. So it's better than an absolute value. These are the basic changes that came from the proposal that Andy and Rob did. So we have the comparison with a single result. We had that already, also with several results, where, for example, we have a filter that you include past or warning results. You can define the number of comparison results you want to compare with, in this case 3, and I also think 3 is the default value we're going to go with. And you can define an aggregate function, so it will calculate an average of the 3 last past or warned results and use that value as a comparison value in the actual evaluation. And with that, I think I will give the microphone over. So nothing did really change in the user walkthrough. There was one question open. So Henrik had a question about providing a data source, and Florian will answer this question later on. But first, I would like to go through a detailed example of the service level objective file. So you see there is all kinds of documentation in there where each and every field is documented pretty neatly, except the total score. But I would like to give the microphone to Christian to give him the chance to walk us through the detailed example of the service level objective file.
Thank you. Should I start
would you like to share yourself?
Yeah,
because it makes it way easier for you.
I will start with the objectives. Let me see, where's my screen? So you should see the YAML file now, right?
Yes, we see it. Yep.
Yeah, so I'll start with the objectives that you can define. And the main thing here is an objective, so an SLI has a name, and it has a pass criteria and a warning criteria. And if none of the criteria here match, it will automatically fail. And we want to discuss today, or the syntax that we use here, in addition to the logic that we use here. As an example, we have here the response time 95 percentile. And we want to define that it should pass if the relative change between the last couple of values, or the last value and the current value, is less than 10%. And we also want to pass if the absolute value is less than 200, in this case, maybe milliseconds. The idea being is that these two criteria are combined with an OR. So this syntax here would translate into a pass if relative change is less than or equal 10%, or the absolute value, and I have an error here, is less than 200. You could also try to extend the criteria here, which we've done for the warning case. The idea here being is we want to warn as long as the change is relatively small. So the change is relatively between 15% or -8%. So that would be a relative change with an upper bound and a lower bound. But we also want to say it needs to be less than 500 milliseconds. So for instance, this three criteria would be connected with an AND. So it would be relative change less than 15%, more than -8%, and in total less than 500 milliseconds. To see this as an example when this would be true, if we had a response time of 300 milliseconds in the first run, and in the second run, we had a response time of 400 milliseconds, let's say like this, then this would result in a relative change of 33%. So let me do it like this. And that would be too much, obviously. So 33% would be above the 15%. It would be in total less than 500 milliseconds, but this is an AND criteria, and this is already above the 15%, so this would fail. But when would this not fail? If the first run would be 300 milliseconds and the second run would be 310 milliseconds, then this would be a relative change of about, what is it, 3%, I think. And 3% is less than 15%. It's more than -8%. And the total time is also less than 500 milliseconds. With this warning criteria, however, we can make sure, let's say we have 20 test runs over the time, and continuously this value, response time 95 percentile, is rising, and at some point it's maybe 490 milliseconds is what we have stored as an average. And the new value that we get is maybe 501 milliseconds. Now, the relative change of this would also only be a couple percent, 2-3% or something. So it would fall into this criteria, but this last criteria, it wouldn't be fulfilled anymore because it's more than 500 milliseconds now. And we would send, in this case, it wouldn't even be a warning. In this case, it would go into the last part, so it would fail. So this would be a criteria you would combine with and this way you combine it with an OR. Obviously, there can be different use cases where one or another is more important. We have one use case here. I have a typo here. For, let's say you want to count SQL statements. For instance, you could say, if the relative change of SQL statements between test runs is exactly 0%, so it's the same amount every time, then this should obviously pass because no SQL statement has been added, none has been removed, that should be okay. But we can also say we want to have a warning if the number of SQL statements has changed slightly. So for instance, we got roughly 5% more or less SQL statements. So I will have an example for that in a second. But we still want to say, as long as it's less than 100 SQL statements, we don't bother, it's a pass anyway. So in this example, let's say we had 100 SQL statements in the first run. And in the new run, in the second run, we have 105 SQL statements. Let's say 104 SQL statements. That's a relative change of 4%. So obviously it's a change, so this criteria is not fulfilled. The second criteria says it needs to be less than 100. It's 104, so this is also not fulfilled. So it is definitely not a pass. Then we can go and look on the warning criteria, and the warning criteria says, oh, it's less than 5% change. So warning is okay. So it's a warning, we will send a warning. What would have happened if this value would have been 98 and this value would have been 99? So we had 98 runs recorded for the last couple of runs. 98 statements, I mean, and in the second run we have 99. This is a relative change of about 1%. So it would be within the warning criteria. But the second criteria here, which is again connected as an OR statement, says it is less than 100 SQL statements, and less than 100 SQL statements is automatically a pass. So with that kind of syntax, it allows any combination of AND as well as OR statements that we can use for specifying our lower bounds, upper bounds, and thresholds. The same is obviously true, let's say, for security vulnerabilities. What if we only want one criteria? So it doesn't matter what is happening. We do not want any security vulnerabilities detected, or if one is detected, we don't want to go on. So we only pass if the number of criteria, the absolute number is 0 and nothing else. So yeah, these are essentially some of the cases. You can obviously define more than 2. So if you say you have a third criteria here that you want to connect with an OR statement, let's say, I don't know, if it's above 5,000 milliseconds, again, it's okay. For whatever reason you wanna say, if it's really, really high, then we don't care. It must be, there's something behind in the logic that says if it's more than 5,000 milliseconds, it's okay. Yeah, doesn't make much sense in this example, but you could do that if you wanted. All right, so that's basically part of the objectives you can define. And the other thing that we...
Christian, can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
So thanks for explaining everything. Do I understand correctly, if the pass criteria, if everything's evaluated and it's passing, then the warning is not evaluated anymore?
As soon as we have a pass, then we have a pass, and warning doesn't matter anymore. That was the idea. So if you have criteria that might be overlapping, the first one would always be pass. Pass is always stronger than a warning.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
This also allows, so like this change between -8 and 15%, this change would also be triggered by this criteria. So if it's less than 10%, it's obviously also less than 15%. So it should always be, the pass is always the stronger criteria.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions for the objectives? All right, Dirk, do you want to continue with the comparison strategy, single result, and what is the other one?
Sure.
Because I think that one was on your list still, or do you want me to show it?
No, it's okay. Thanks for your explanation around the pass and warning criteria. So you handled the objectives, and we still need to talk about the scoring, right?
Yeah, I left that out on purpose.
Perfect.
But I can talk about that as well.
No, it's okay. So for comparison, as said before, we have two different possible comparison scenarios. One is where you only compare with a single value. Then, of course, you say compare with single result, and you can compare with several results. Then you would put several results here. And you can define filter criteria for previous results that you want to include in the comparison. Default is all, so regardless of if the evaluation has passed or has resulted in a warning or has failed for that previous value, it is included in the comparison. That is the default value. And other possible values are pass, where only past evaluations are included, or pass or warn, where also pass or warn or evaluations that resulted in a warning are included in the comparison. Then you can define the number of comparison results you want to include and the aggregate function. I think I've done that like 10 minutes ago, but there we go again. Then we can define objectives. And this is what Christian already presented to us. And then now it's time to talk about the scores again. So by default, we will handle it like that if an SLI, if the evaluation of one SLI is successful, it will result in 1 point. If the result is warning, it will result in half a point. And if it fails, it will result in 0 points. And you have the possibility to define weights. So for each SLI. So by default, the weight of each SLI is 1. So the maximum number of points that can be achieved in this example is 3, because we have 3 SLIs defined. Now, if I say the security vulnerabilities SLI is that important for me, I want to have it more weight in the evaluation. I can, for example, just say here weight 2, then it counts twice as much, right? So if it passes, it counts for 2 points, and if there is a warning, it counts for 1 point. And this is of course also reflected in the overall maximum score. And then the actual score that is calculated from the current evaluation is divided by the maximum score, and that yields the total score of that evaluation. So it's always a percentage, and you can then define pass and warning thresholds that are interpreted as greater or equal than. So for example, if you have 90%, it would pass. And if you have 89%, it would be a warning. And if you have 74%, it would fail the overall evaluation. And then we also had the discussion, because we had a lot of feedback around that the weight alone is not enough sometimes. So it's good that you can actually weight some SLIs more than others. But there is the concept of key SLIs. And if one of the key SLIs fails, then the entire evaluation should fail regardless of the other results. And to accommodate for that, I think this is missing in the example right now, but let me just write it here. We had the idea of including a simple field that says Key SLI that is by default false, of course. But if you set it to true and the evaluation for this SLI fails, then by default, it's a failed evaluation. Of course, if you have warning criteria, so if, for example, let's add it to the SQL statements example here. If the evaluation result of this SLI falls in yields a warning result, then the result of the entire evaluation is also warning because the Key SLI true statement is set here. And I think these are all the details that there are to know about scoring, the weights, the Key SLIs, and the comparison modes that we have. So are there any questions at that point in time with regards to the service level objectives definition?
I think one question that we raised earlier we can discuss in this round. If a Key SLI is defined, should it be only one Key SLI, or is it okay if there's multiple Key SLIs? And if there's multiple Key SLIs, should the logic be such that if, let's say there's 4 Key SLIs, one of them has a warning, another one has a fail, does this mean that the whole evaluation fails because one of the Key SLIs failed? Or do all Key SLIs have to fail? Or what is the desired behavior of multiple Key SLIs?
Mm-hmm. Maybe someone in the meeting that was not part of that discussion yet can share his thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So let's just enumerate the question. Question number 1, should there be more than one Key SLI allowed?
I would go for yes.
Yeah, this is Rob. I mean, I think that the Key SLI would probably be, not. It's a Key SLI. So to me, my opinion would be yes, support multiple. Probably people shouldn't. And I would say if any one of them failed, the whole thing fails. That would be kind of my opinion.
That was similar to. It was similar to what we discussed. We would advise people against having more than one Key SLI, but if they had more than one and one of them fails, the whole pipeline or the whole evaluation should fail. Right. That was our idea too.
Right. Because you can also manipulate the weight to kind of give it a higher priority too. So to me, there's different ways to achieve it, and the Key SLI was just kind of a specific use case of if one metric, maybe 2, was really, really important and it failed, it just was a mechanism to force the whole thing to fail.
We actually discussed the use case, why the weights are not enough. Just to add that, let's say you have not just 4 metrics, but 100 metrics. If you then increase the weights of certain metrics, then all the other metrics all of a sudden become absolutely useless. And therefore, the Key SLI would be a little bit better for explaining what is happening.
That's a very valid point. I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Rob, you worked on the proposal, and what do you think of what came out of it?
No, I think it's very good. I really like it. My question would be, more. I mean, maybe it's outside the spec. What's the first implementation? Is the first implementation going to be CLI, REST, both? Is the data store part of this? And presumably the UI is a later change. I'm just kind of curious how it's going to get implemented. I guess, long story short, what's the implementation strategy?
So it will to a large percentage follow the user walkthrough we've defined here. So you create a project, you add your secret if you need it, apply uniform. We don't support that yet, but that is also not needed anymore because we just don't work with the events that we don't need anymore. So it doesn't matter what service is sitting behind a topic that is not used. And I think, or maybe Johannes or someone from the development side could answer this question, because I think it would make more sense if you answer that.
Sure. Yeah, I can take over. Yeah, as you can see right here, in the future you will get support with the CLI, where you can say Keptn send event, then you specify the name of the event you want to send to Keptn, and then Keptn forwards it to the component that takes over the responsibility of doing the job. And you also can retrieve events from Keptn, and therefore we have the Keptn get event command, and you just specify the type of event you want to get from Keptn, and when the event is available, then you get your result to the console output, and you can also use the API for retrieving events from Keptn. And what you just have to specify is the Keptn context you want to get the event from, and then you get it.
Coming back to Rob's question, so it works both through the CLI and the API, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like it's going to be an sort of an asynchronous kind of mechanism where I submit my evaluation, I receive a Keptn context, and then I have to use that Keptn context to then query for results as a second step.
Correct.
Absolutely correct. Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. So there'll be some sort of, so if I'm like in a code pipeline, the scenario of, say I'm in Jenkins. So I don't know how in Jenkins you might do that, unless, because there's sort of a risk, I guess, of a timeout, right? Do you like hard code some sort of wait time, or will the REST interface be synchronous so that, it may take a little while to process, but at least it's a synchronous REST call?
Most likely not, at least not in the beginning. So the reason why it's an asynchronous call is that it might take several minutes to gather all of the SLIs,
okay, and
do the evaluation. So the evaluation part is the quick part, of course, but the gathering of the SLIs values takes a considerable amount of time, which is why it makes no sense to make it a synchronous call.
Okay.
Maybe at a later point in time we find a more elegant solution for that, but right now this is the way that we're going to implement that.
Okay. Yeah, as long as sort of that second call has some sort of, positive error message, not an error message, like, results not ready or something like that, then that way you know programmatically to keep retrying.
Yeah, the error message will tell you that no event could be found for this context.
Okay.
Would a certain HTTP status code be suitable here, maybe, that we can define as not ready yet?
You will get the 400, meaning that no service is available, but we haven't talked about a specific response code.
Yeah, we'll consider it. I mean, we don't have to decide right here, but it might be, there's advantages to do what Christian was saying, like more like, that there is an event as opposed to there is not an event and it's just not ready yet.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Because I think that's what we're going to try. Like, as soon as you guys have it ready, like, I know that I will immediately try to incorporate the quality gate in at least 2, maybe 3 different pipeline types, like Jenkins, Azure DevOps, and then probably Mike Villager with probably Trident and Concourse with, so we'll definitely want to try it. So we'll just have, that way we can have good examples out there for how to do it. And the And the any just one thought I had was with the indicator file itself. Do you have maybe you have to go back? Was there this? There's the same concept of a data source. I'm sorry if you already showed this, but we will support multiple data sources like we did before within the indicator file itself.
I think this is the perfect segue to Florian's topic. So
Okay.
maybe he can share the bigger picture of what the Lighthouse service actually does and how the different let's say SLI providers then communicate with the Lighthouse service, and how the definition of also custom SLIs could work in the future. So I will stop sharing and give the microphone over to Florian.
All right, let me just share my screen. All right, you should now see a sequence diagram.
Yeah.
All right, so since we re-implemented the whole logic of how we're evaluating results, because previously, if you recall it, we used the pitometer service. And one of the main pain points we had there was if we would want to add another data source. So for example, in addition to Dynatrace and Prometheus, we wanted to support, for example, some other data source like Neotis, Neoload. We would have to change the source code of the pitometer service itself and include the required node modules in that case, and implement some logic around that data source. Now we wanted to make this whole thing more flexible and more extensible. So the way it works now is that we have the evaluation service, or the Lighthouse service as it will be called, and this Lighthouse service will trigger the retrieval of metrics from an external data source by sending a certain type of Keptn event, which we will look at closely in a few seconds. And basically a new data source, if we want to implement a new data source, the data source will be implemented as an HTTP service that can receive HTTP requests with a certain format that we're going to look at shortly. And this service is responsible for retrieving the required SLI values. So for example, the error rate, the throughput, and the response time that we saw in the document earlier that Dirk showed. Then it will retrieve the metrics, and then as a result, the data source service should send out another event that contains the values for those SLI values. And now we're going to look at an example of those requests. So in that case, the incoming event that the data source service should be able to process to is of the type Keptn internal event get SLI. And this event will basically contain the type of the desired SLI provider. So in that case, it's Prometheus. Then it will also always contain the project, the service, and the stage, a start and an end timestamp to enable the data source to calculate the duration of the tests and the exact time frame, and an array containing the name of the indicators that should be retrieved. So in that example, we have the throughput, the error rate, and the 50% percentile for the response time. And then the way the data source retrieves those values is completely up to the data source itself. But the only obligation of that service is to transform it in an event that looks like this. So what are the most important properties here? So first of all, the type needs to be like that. So sh Keptn internal event get SLI done. Just on a side note, this is still underdeveloped and subject to change. But we will, of course, provide a documentation on how to write those evaluation services or data source services. And in the payload of the event, the actual values for the retrieved metrics will be contained. So in that case, we have the name of the metric, for example, throughput, then the value, then an indicator if the retrieval of the metric or SLI value was successful. And if it was not successful, we also have the possibility of including a message that pretty much describes the reason why it couldn't be received. So in that case, if, for example, we weren't able to retrieve the response time P50 SLI value, we can send back an object that looks like that. And we also already have an example of one of those data source services available in the Keptn contrib organization. So if you go to that org, you will find the Prometheus SLI service. And in the develop branch, you will see an example implementation of such a service, along with a detailed README, which describes, for example, also how you can override queries and define for example, the Prometheus endpoint. So if you, for example, need access or the credential of an external service, you could do that in a Kubernetes secret. And if you want to configure certain aspects of the implementation of your data source service, you can, for example, use a config map as we did here. All right. And yeah, of course, if you want to implement your own service, you can go to this example, but also, of course, contact us directly and ask for help if you want to contribute a data source service.
Yeah, this is really cool. I mean, this is rough. I really like how it's flexible and solves that problem of new backend providers coming in without having to recompile like the service. So I think this is a really good solution here. One question I had was just maybe, can you elaborate on, it's basically the registry, to me, like there's a registry of the indicator files themselves. Is that, obviously it's defined at the moment in the indicator file, but are each of these indicator names, unique to the data source, or were you trying to come up with a standard set of names?
I think I got your question. So the way we did it right now, or what the current state that you have right now, is that we have 3 predefined metrics. So the error rate, the throughput, and the response time that are also described in the Google Drive doc about this use case. And those metrics have to be implemented by the data source service. But we will also allow users to define any type of queries to extend those. Does that answer your question?
That example you have there, like throughput query, that would be that would be the name of the ID that we would put into the service level objective file, right? It would be
without the query.
Without the query. Yeah. So this is still subject to change, but on a conceptual level, that's correct. So so the name of the queries are throughput, error rate, and response time in that case. This is not up to date yet.
in the scenario where I have two data sources that both provide, say, error rate, and you can only have one, how would you deal with that? Or what's your
the way we are doing it right now is that we can configure one SLI source per project.
Oh, I see. So for like the standard SLIs, you can only pick one, and you just have to decide which one you want.
Exactly. So for example, if you have the project sock shop, you can configure Keptn and tell Keptn to retrieve the SLI values for this project, either from Dynatrace or from Prometheus or from another potential data source. But currently you cannot use multiple data sources within one project. But if you have another project, you can of course configure another data source for that project.
And architecturally speaking, there is nothing from stopping us to extend this functionality at a later point. So to say that you have a Prometheus data source for metric A and the Dynatrace data source for metric B, but this is something that requires a little bit more thought, and it's not something we support right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would think that we would want. I mean, I guess I was thinking the scenario of just an individual metric like error rate, and you could only have one error rate. But but I would think we'd want to have that ability to say, right, some data comes from, have the ability to say some data comes from some of the metrics come from Dynatrace, say some of the metrics come from Neoload, as an example, and to be able to kind of combine those in a single, project service. So yeah, I understand version 1. So yeah, so version 2, yeah, or future versions, yeah, I definitely see that coming up as a requirement.
Yeah, and maybe to add on that, what Florian just showed, the very same or a very similar implementation is already work in progress for the Dynatrace data source. Yeah, the repo is already there. It's just in a feature branch right now. This is also still pending some changes, but there will be a configuration map as well. So the idea is you can configure Prometheus to have certain queries, or you can configure Dynatrace to have certain queries. And there is obviously the same set of metrics, the free metrics are already available that will query Dynatrace for error rate, throughput, and I think response time.
All right, are there any other questions regarding the topics we've discussed? Because if not, then we will just end the meeting. And if there are any questions, just reach out to us through the usual channels. Either open a GitHub issue, write us on our Slack channel, write us an email, call us, find us and talk to us, whatever suits your needs. Thanks for joining, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.